Chapter 7. Wilted. The forest was deathly quiet, its usual chorus of chirping crickets and rustling leaves swallowed by an oppressive, unnatural silence. Not even the wind dared to move. Overhead the moon was hidden behind thick, black clouds, casting only the faintest golden glow on the tree-lined trail. The world felt frozen, suspended in a state of an uneasy loneliness. Miles Carter stood in the center of the path, staring down at the footprints ahead. They were fresh, too fresh. He had been following them for the past 2 hours, tracking through the thick woods, trying to find the source of the mysterious voice that had called out to him just before dusk. At first it had been a soft whisper on the wind, barely audible over the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots. But then it had become louder, more insistent, and most unnervingly, it had sounded like someone he knew, his sister, Rachel. Rachel was 14 when it happened. Just like any other day, Miles vigorously devoted himself to his job. He wouldn't even answer calls unless it was an emergency. Miles was deep in thought on this particular day, while working at the machine shop. His phone violently buzzed like a chainsaw in his drawer. His mother was calling, hoping he could pick up his sister from school. Little did he know, she tirelessly waited for him to pull into the school parking lot. His music blaring in a thunderous rump of exhaust like he always did, but this time he never showed. It was far too late when Miles clocked out and grabbed his phone. Every month, Miles affectionately placed fresh flowers on the side of the busy highway where it happened. He'd carefully brush off the area and somberly collect his thoughts as always. But when he'd heard her voice calling for him, faint and pleading, something inside him had shifted. Something desperate and primal had surged to the surface. He couldn't explain or rationalize it, but he had to follow the voice. The possibility, however impossible, that his sister could still be out there in these woods was enough to pull him deep into the forest, into the dark. But now, after hours of walking and chasing this phantom voice, the truth has settled over him like a cold mist. This wasn't Rachel. Couldn't be. Something else was out there. Miles was an odd man. He knew that, a loner by nature. He'd always been drawn to things other people avoided. Dark, strange things that whispered of otherworldly possibilities. His fascination with the supernatural had started young, fueled by an insatiable curiosity that had grown into a full-blown obsession. Where others would have turned back and fled in the face of the unexplainable, Miles had always been one to push forward, to look deeper. Maybe it was because he hadn't had much to lose. His life wasn't exactly what you'd call fulfilling. No close friends, no family left. He had no fear of the unknown because, in many ways, he felt like he was already living it. Or maybe he wanted to atone somehow to make up to his little sister for all the times he hadn't been there when she needed him. Still, even for someone like him, the forest tonight felt different, felt wrong. The air was thick with an energy he couldn't place. It made the hairs on his neck stand up. His instinct screaming at him to turn back, but his curiosity, his need to know, pushed him forward. The voice had led him here for a reason. He was sure of it. "Help me," came the whisper again, faint but unmistakable. Rachel's voice. Miles' heart quickened. His rational mind screamed at him to stop, turn around, leave the woods, and never return. But something deeper, a hope he hadn't realized he still held on to, kept him moving forward. And then, up ahead, he saw it. a clearing. The trees parted, revealing an open space bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone, ancient, weathered, and covered in strange markings. But it wasn't the stone that caught Miles' attention. It was the figure standing beside it. He was tall, thin, and draped in ragged, dark clothing that blended with the shadows around him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair hung long, greasy strands around his face. His eyes sunken and hollow, fixed on Miles the moment he stepped into the clearing. The man's lips twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth, only hunger. "Ah, you've come," the man rasped, his voice low and rough, like the cracking of old, dry leaves. It sent a shiver down Miles' spine. Miles stopped, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Something about the man, about his presence, rooted him to the ground he stood on. Who are you?" Miles stammered, his voice shaking. He knew this wasn't Rachel. He knew this wasn't anything human. But the fear in his chest kept him from thinking clearly. The man took a step closer, his movement slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. His smile widened, revealing sharp, yellow teeth. "I've had many names," the man said, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo in the still air. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is what I can offer you." Miles's blood ran cold. The man's words slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts and clouding his judgment. He could feel the pull of something deep within him, a desire he hadn't known existed. "What do you want?" Miles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes gleamed with a dark, malevolent light. He stepped closer still, his presence now overwhelming, suffocating. "Life," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. "I can give you what you have. I can give you what I have. Power beyond your imagination." Miles stared at him, his mind racing. The air felt thick, heavy with something he couldn't place. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for his answer. But before he could speak, the man's smile faded. His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "But you must take it willingly," the man hissed. "It must be your choice. Your soul for mine?" The words hung in the air like a curse. Before Miles could process what was happening, the world around him shifted. The clearing disappeared, swallowed by darkness, and he found himself standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around him. The man was still there, but now his form was different. Twisted, his skin seemed to ripple and shift like something crawled beneath the surface. His eyes, once hollow and sunken, now burdened with an eternal fire. His limbs like the trunk of a tree. "Look," the man said, his voice still raspy but now laced with desperation. "Look at what I've become. This is the price I paid for immortality. Centuries of suffering, trapped in this decaying form. My soul is rotting. I can't escape." Miles felt his stomach churn. The man's face was contorted, his features stretched and distorted like melted wax. His voice had changed, too, becoming harsher, more frantic. "But you," the man continued, his voice rising, "you can end this for me. You can take my place. You can have everything. Eternal life. Endless power. Miles shook his head, stepping back toward the edge of the cliff. His mind was reeling. The man's words were seeping into his thoughts, twisting them, making him doubt everything he knew. But something deep inside him, some primal instinct, was screaming at him to resist. I don't want to. I don't want it, Miles said, his voice barely audible over the wind. The man's face twisted into a snarl, his eyes blazing with fury. You will take it, he hissed, his voice rising to a deafening roar. You have no choice. The serene forest raged with fury as the branches and leaves shook fearlessly. As though the forest was the being, and the being was the forest. You must take it, the man growled, advancing on Miles with haste and fury. I can't bear this existence any longer. I'm trapped in this rotting body, trapped in this endless cycle. Please, please. His voice cracked, and for a moment Miles saw the depth of his torment. The man was suffering. He had been suffering for centuries. His immortality had become a curse he could no longer bear. But the thought of taking it, of becoming what the man was, it chilled Miles to the core. I can't, Miles whispered, backing away. The man's face twisted into a mask of rage, his voice shrieking. You will. You have to. I need this to end. Miles felt the walls of the trees closing in around him, the air growing colder, thicker. The man was closing in on him, his eyes wide with desperation, his voice a rasping, terrifying growl. And then in a moment of clarity, Miles knew what he had to do. No, he said, his voice steady for the first time. I won't take it. I won't become you. The being froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. The curse was attached to him before he could remember. It was binding. The only way to relinquish the harsh, unforgiving responsibility was to pass it along to someone else, willingly. I saw it. I was there that day. The being is now calm and collected, his voice smooth once more. His words are twisting and cunning. It was my fault, as a matter of fact. Miles cautiously turned back around. His demeanor changed from anger to curiosity as he naively dropped his guard. What are you talking about? Miles said swiftly, like a blade cutting through the tension. Rachel, the being said. His voice was laced with poison. Rage traveled through his body as he clenched his fist, holding back his fury. Don't fuck with me, Miles said, unforgiving. I still have it, the being said carelessly. I still have the little pink rose you gave her. And the letter. Oh, the letter. There was so much blood you could barely read what you wrote. You want to hear it? Stop, Miles said coldly. The being plunged into its limbs into the ground, the earth shuddering beneath the force. Slowly it withdrew, drawing out a fragile pink rose. Its petal crumpled and faded, as if clinging desperately to life. Miles' voice trembled as he spoke, his tears trickling down in uneven streams. I hate you. The being reached down and placed the rose on a mossy patch of grass. Is she still here? And you can be with her. You can make up for all the times you weren't there for her, the being said. Miles. Rachel's voice bounced around through the forest like a fairy and landed on the dirt where the wilted rose was. You can free her from my grasp. Just take my hand, the being murmured, his voice unsettled and calm. She will be released, and you will be bound, Miles. Miles' gaze locked on the being, his fragile eyes wide with agony. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him, while a cold breeze curled through the trees. whispering secrets and dread. Miles willingly reached for the being's hand, without hesitation. The moment their fingers touched, a blinding white light consumed the forest. Chapter 7. Wilted.